Okay, welcome to our teach-in on Donald Trump and the crisis of U.S. democracy. I'd like to begin with a disclaimer. While this event has been formally advertised as a Korbel teach-in, please know that in no way does this event represent the official views of the Josef Korbel School of International Studies. Comments that you are about to hear should be attributed solely to the individual professors who will be speaking today and in no way represent the official view of the Josef Korbel School. Now, thank you all for coming. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. My name is Nader Hashemi. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies, and we're happy to present this event in conjunction with our friends at the C Center. First of all, can people at the back hear me? Great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, fellow students, friends of the university, if you haven't noticed already, our country is in deep peril, and we're gathered here today to try and discuss it, to analyze it, and to try to begin to figure out what should be done about it. I'm hoping this meeting will be the beginning, or perhaps serve as a catalyst or a spark, particularly to students, to begin to organize your own meetings and to invite others to participate in those meetings. This crisis is not going away anytime soon. My own view is that we're at a historic turning point for the United States with ripple effects that will affect the entire world. I think the next 4 years, in my own reading, are absolutely crucial. Either we begin to seriously address some of the structural foundations that are at the root of this political crisis and that has brought this crisis before us, or begin the slow and steady slide toward the abyss and in the direction of political authoritarianism. Let me just set the stage and the sort of mood for today's discussion with a quick observation on how democracies decline. Now, social scientists are in broad agreement that signs of democratic breakdown and the beginning of political authoritarianism can be characterized with the following series of events, not necessarily in chronological order. Number one, media intimidation and restrictions. The identification of crises or political paralysis to justify new emergency powers. Attacks on minorities or the scapegoating of foreigners. Closing the space for civil society, especially in terms of restricting funding, legal cases, raids, arrests. The rhetorical rejection of the current political system, a significant shift in discourse. Expanding the size of courts or other bodies to stack it with partisan officials or judges. Weakening of the legislature, intimidation of legislators, silencing of political opposition, significant increase in internal security forces. But the key point to keep in mind here is that democratic breakdown mostly happens when it's unanticipated and supporters of democracy fail to mobilize. And I think that brings us to our panel today. I've asked several of my colleagues to come here to really ruminate on this particular moment of crisis that we're facing and the broad challenges that lie ahead. I've asked them each to begin with a series of 10 minutes of introductory remarks, really focusing on their own personal evaluation and assessment of this moment of crisis, and then with a possible sort of end to their remarks in terms of what the way forward could be or should be for concerned citizens. And then after each has presented for 10 minutes, we will open it to the question and answer session, and I'll get to the rules of that when we arrive there. Since this is an in-house event, I'm assuming that most people know our panelists. I don't want to take up much time with long introductions. We're going to try and wrap up at around 1:30, 1:40 at the latest. But in terms of just a brief introduction, all of our panelists here are distinguished colleagues. We're lucky to have them here at the Korbel School. Erica Chenoweth teaches courses and pursues research on political violence and its alternatives with a special focus on civil resistance and nonviolent political action and protest. George Demartino teaches courses and pursues research in economic ethics, international political economy, international economic integration. Alan Gilbert is a political theorist who works on democratic theory, nonviolence, and the history of political thought. He's teaching a course next quarter that's directly related to this meeting that we're having called Democracy and War, Plato and Thucydides, on how democracies die, the Trump-Bannon phenomenon, and how to defeat political tyranny. And last, but certainly not least, is Marie Berry. She's a sociologist, teaches at the intersection of gender, violence, and development. I want to thank all of them for being here. And we're going to begin with Marie Berry. The floor is hers for the next 10 minutes. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thanks, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people here today. This is a great turnout, so thanks for coming. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one facet of what Professor Hashemi just kind of mentioned about all the different things that are going on. So this is just sort of one slice of it. But I'll kind of wrap this in, though, to some of the comments that my colleagues are going to make about, what are some effective strategies to resist. And what I'm talking about specifically here is this kind of broader process of social closure that's going on. We might think of it also as a process of hyper-nationalism, this idea really of a sort of redefinition of what the American nation means. What is a nation? This is something that I've talked about in my classes at some length. We sometimes think of it as a state, but of course it's a bit different, right? It's something that is imagined. It's an imagined community that's grounded in, some sort of common origin or historical experience, and oftentimes has a common sort of sense of a common destiny. It's not the same as the state, but there is a lot of overlap. And with the emergence of welfare institutions, sort of that are part of a state, right? Social Security, Medicare, even schools, and so forth. There is a sense of obligatory solidarity that emerges when we think about what a nation is and who is a member of the nation, because there's some sense that that we need to police who is a legitimate member of the nation and then who is kind of an illegitimate member of the nation, because there's a sense that some degree of our own comfort is bound up with this, or some measure of our own comfort must be sacrificed at some, for others that are in more need. And what this means is that there's always an active process of actually defining who is in and who is out of the nation. And this is just kind of a quick, little bit complicated looking chart on these various dimensions of social closure. So there's this idea right now that's being sort of actively reimagined, I would argue, by the Trump administration, is about who is actually kind of a legitimate American, right? Who is a legitimate member of the nation that can actually kind of participate in this national imagining of a future destiny, a shared sort of sense of common survival. And this involves everything from the way in which this boundary is being drawn around people that are innocent versus people that are guilty, people that are citizens versus people that are aliens, kind of the kind of dominant race versus ethnic and racial minorities. A lot of rhetoric these days about innocence and criminality, right? Kind of innocent people that are real Americans versus criminals that are kind of coming from outside or coming from even within our own inner cities. Now I'm setting this up, but I'm going to make a point, hopefully, that will be clear. I want to talk quickly about how Trump is doing this, how his administration is actively involved in this process of kind of social closure around what is the American nation at its essence. And the first sort of step here is this creation of a general feeling of instability and insecurity that he's fostered all the way from the beginning of his announcement that he was running for president to the very, very dark speech that he gave when he accepted the Republican nomination. And also, certainly on Twitter, he's becoming quite famous or infamous about using words like carnage or infestation to refer to the threats that real Americans, authentic Americans, are facing, right? There's also a way of, again, policing this sort of boundary around who is part of the in-group and who is part of the out-group, between this conflation between insecurity and people that threaten the security of our nation, right? So this idea that radical Islamic terrorism is a threat to the nation, this idea that Mexicans, as he's kind of called out, are a threat to American citizens, legitimate American citizens, right? Now, the problem with this becomes when there's a collectivization of guilt. And I teach a lot on comparative genocide, right? And so what we see, and the reason that I'm bringing this up is because when we see the kind of collectivization of guilt, or this extension of an individual's criminality to the entire collective, right? The extension of an individual who has perpetrated a crime to this idea that all people that are here without documentation are criminals, or all Muslims are criminals. This becomes really serious, and this is something that we see through a lot of the kind of speeches, that there's actually an active process of doing this, of conflating individual sort of guilt or criminality with entire nations, entire religions, and so forth. Now, for those of you who've heard me talk about the Rwandan genocide before, I'll just give a quick example of where this can go, and I won't suggest that this is where we're going at all. I don't think it is. But there becomes a very scary tipping point when we begin to conflate issues, right? And this is actually something that when I was listening to Stephen Miller yesterday, as he went on a lot of those morning news shows, you probably heard him as well, that some of his rhetoric actually was quite scary, because it began to conflate different issues. So he's talking at some length about the process of voter fraud, right? And he's talking about all the undocumented people, or illegals, as he calls them, that are in the United States that are suspected of committing some sort of voter fraud, right? But he quickly jumps from this idea of voter fraud to terrorism, and then again, that we're going to protect innocent men, women, and children from violent, criminal, illegal immigrants, right, that need to be removed from this country. In those three sentences, he basically takes kind of what could be actually is most likely, and most of the research suggests, is an issue of kind of messy record keeping, right, in our voting records, and extends it to kind of suggest that all these sort of illegitimate people that are potentially voting also kind of have these links and ties to terrorists, to criminals, and so forth. When I teach on Rwanda, I talk about this idea that there was a tipping point in Rwanda as well in the early 1990s, when there was an invading army comprised of mostly Tutsi refugees from Uganda that invaded the northern border of Rwanda. And there was a process in which individual Tutsis that were just living as citizens in Rwanda became somehow kind of conflated with this idea of the invading army, right? But the invading army was more than just an invading army. All of a sudden, the issues became conflated there as well, and it became blamed for rapid inflation. That kind of, it became part of the same conversation around land scarcity, around drought, and all of a sudden, individual citizens became somehow sort of bound up as guilty parties in this kind of broad process of social threat, this kind of broad idea of social threat. And so this brings me to my main point, which is that as we get involved with the resistance, we will need to identify key policies, people to target, and so forth for our protests, for our sit-ins, and for the variety of tactics that my colleagues are going to, I think, talk about a little bit more at length. And it's very possible, this is just kind of a quick list of some of the policies that people are already mobilizing resistance around, from the executive orders on immigrants and sanctuary cities and the wall, to a few days later, the ban on refugees, the so-called Muslim ban, to the recent raids, ICE raids, right, that we've seen in Austin and California and other places in the country. And as we go forward as a movement and actually see these policies, we will need to organize a resistance around these specific kind of tangible items that we can point at that say, we need to mobilize to actually get this to be overturned. But the problem is, while we can, actually, oh, there's my picture, can use those tactics against these specific policies, if we take a more long-term horizon and emphasize a bit more on the idea of holistic resistance, this is also important, because while we may undo specific policies and pieces of legislation, we will not be able to effectively undo the process of social closure that is already happening, right? The process of social closure and exclusion is becoming embedded into our own understandings of who are legitimate and illegitimate members of the American nation. It is being embedded into the way that children, fearing the arrest of their parents, their undocumented mother or father, are shaking from fear as they go to bed at night. It is being embedded into the cognitive structures and schemas of how people, ordinary citizens, see the world, right? The graduate student of this university, of this school, who feared that his Muslim name and skin color would prevent him from seeking asylum safely in the States and thus fled in the night to Canada. The students of color, Muslim students, queer students, and so many others who do not feel as safe in this space, in this country, as they used to. And thus, while our protests and our movement to resist, our protests and our movement to resist must simultaneously encompass an effort to resist policies, while also cultivating a more holistic ethos of radical inclusion, of care, of respect, of what Van Jones has been talking about as a love army, about how in the last day, the Women's March and other organizations have kind of rebranded tomorrow, Valentine's Day, as the day of revolutionary love. And what I mean here is a different strategy. While we need the protests and we need the tactics to address a lot of the kind of concrete policies that are at play, there's also, I think, a need and a space for this kind of more holistic, ongoing effort to cultivate kindness, to cultivate nonviolence as part of a personal political ethos that we live and engage in our interactions with every single day, in our friendships, in our professional relationships, and so on. So I want to leave you with that, with this idea that when we talk about tactics of resistance, it's one part of the story, and it's a critical one at this point in time. But that there's also, because of this process of social closure that is ongoing, that we'll need to also actually begin to embody more radical forms, I think, of resistance that will have to look a bit different and may really, really kind of foreground and privilege the arts, privilege music, and privilege the way, and really focus on the way in which we, I think, as human beings actually interact with other human beings. And I'll leave it at that.
Good afternoon. I'm really glad to see everybody here, and I want to thank Nader and Alan for convening us, and Debbie and the C Center for co-hosting. In the interest of brevity, what I'm going to do is just kind of briefly review some implications from different research, but in the interest of providing resources to support the claims I'm going to make, I'll just let you know that I'm going to post a lot of the links to the materials I'm about to mention on my blog, Rational Insurgent. And I'll try to do that by tonight so that if people want to follow up with some of the specifics I'm going to mention, they can go there and find these resources. So I wanted to start by just talking about the crisis we're in itself. And some people think the crisis began with the election of Donald Trump, but I think that the crisis was long running. And that Trump's election is kind of a symptom rather of an underlying crisis rather than the expression of it itself. I think that the way people narrate the outcome of the 2016 election itself is strongly correlated with whatever prior beliefs they had about the underlying pathologies of American democracy. So there are those that argue that it was the function of abandonment by neoliberals of the white working class. There are many that talked about Hillary Clinton as a fundamentally flawed candidate. There are many who talk about underlying racism, sexism, misogyny, and other isms that were reflected in the outcome of the election. Some people argue that the release of the letter by James Comey to Congress about the ongoing investigation into Hillary's activities produced an expression of Republican Party discipline that made Republicans come home to the party in the last week. There's an argument that there was Russian intervention. There's an argument that there was extensive voter suppression. There's an argument that the Tea Party seized the ground game prior to the 2016 election and essentially controls the grassroots in a much more unified sense than the fragmented left does. There's an argument that there's an automation revolution that is actually exacerbated by globalization. And of course, there's an argument that the United States has long been under attack by both jihadist terrorism and other types of domestic political unrest that have given rise to a law and order president. Now, I'm not going to tell you which of these arguments I buy into because, as I mentioned, I think that the way that we wind up in litigating the outcome of this election largely lines up to what we thought was pervasive in the country prior to the election itself. But what I am going to say is that the way that we narrate what actually happened and come to some kind of consensus among us about the various policy implications that they produce is really important in taking a first step toward laying out a strategy for effectively contesting power in the country going forward. And I would say that there's a really interesting book that just came out by Steph Haggard and Bob Kaufman. It was literally just published weeks ago, that examines all of the different cases of transition to democracy and transition away from democracy. And in their discussion of democratic backsliding into authoritarianism, what they actually say is that there's very little evidence to suggest that underlying economic inequalities are what create this backsliding. And there's very little evidence to suggest that there are institutional failures, that is, that the institutions themselves can sort of protect countries that are undergoing some kind of domestic unrest that's unaddressed through institutional policies to prevent this authoritarian backsliding. But what they argue is that civil society is basically the last bulwark against total collapse into authoritarianism. So in other words, if we've come to the point of crisis itself, that means that people are rejecting our institutions. They're rejecting elections. They're rejecting the judiciary. They're rejecting the executive branch. They're basically saying they don't trust in the legitimacy of our existing political institutions to manage the conflicts that arise in societies. All of these different institutions that we've developed over 1,000 years or more are there to effectively manage conflict within society. So whether it's elections, separation of powers, different constitutional authorities, and so forth, those are all there to try to effectively manage conflict in nonviolent ways. And essentially, if we've come to the point where we're backsliding away from those institutions, there's already a total loss of legitimacy in them. And so the only thing really protecting democracies, or republics as it were, are effective civil societies. So what does that mean? As Nader pointed out, a common element of authoritarianism is a direct assault on civil society, meaning that they're trying to close space for effective organizing in really two dimensions. The first is the grassroots dimension, which is what I would characterize as extra-institutional, because it's actually, the grassroots are not seeking to redress their grievances through the courts or through elections. They're trying to address grievances through their own self-help, their mutual aid communities, their care for one another, and then at times organizing effective resistance, whether that's protest, whether it's strikes and boycotts, other types of effective resistance actions. So those are like extra institutional options. And then there are institutional options, which largely fall into the category of advocacy groups, which do try to push for change through the courts. So they do try to protect people using whatever legal access they actually have. So let me talk about the grassroots options really quickly, and then I'll talk about the institutional options. So the grassroots options that have really started to flourish in the last few months include efforts like Resistance Manual, which if you haven't taken a look at yet, I recommend checking out. Basically what they try to do is lay out the state-to-state issues and then different resources by state about how to effectively advocate. There's a website called Movement Match, which basically tries to, it allows you to sort of identify what your concerns are and what kind of person you are, and then it kind of lines you up with different movements in your area that you might fit in with. There's a group called Movement 2017, which identifies all the different grassroots efforts that might require financial support in your town or area. And then there are movements ongoing, the Women's March, which, by the way, I was involved in helping count, and developed more than twice as many participants as all of the combined armed forces of the United States put together. So I say to like Van Jones, your love army is here. I mean, they're twice as big as the Army. So they've shown up. Now organize them. Moral Mondays, or what's now being called Movement Mondays, is a group of different local efforts that coordinate nationally about different actions that can take place every Monday. So, for example, 2 Mondays ago, there was a big action in Connecticut by one of the pastors that's behind this, John Selders, who sat in at the Connecticut State House in opposition to deportations that were going to take place among undocumented people in Hartford. There's Resist Trump Tuesdays. That's a social media effort that suggests certain types of actions that can take place. There's a group called Wall of Us, which is basically oriented toward resisting efforts to deport people. There's the Scientists' March on Washington, which is going to happen on Earth Day, April 22nd. Here locally, there's a group called Warm Cookies of the Revolution, which makes everyone want to go, right? And Warm Cookies, they call themselves a civic health club, but it's one of the spaces in Denver that's been long-standing that is focused on organizing the community just to come together and have conversations about the quality of our civic life. I would say that Bob Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, gives us a little of a nice framework by which to think about how civil society can effectively protect kind of the republic, if you want to call it that. But one of the things that he argues is that the decline of civil society has allowed for a much more kind of elite-oriented politics, even when these are populist elites. And so one of the best ways to preserve the quality of civic life is to actually have a civic life and have people get together. So, for me, it's like I'm trying not to eat alone, right? Like when I'm having a meal, I'm going to have a meal with other people. I'm trying not to have it be the same people every day, maybe other people, maybe people I don't usually talk to. But it's really important for people of different political persuasions to start to talk with one another about the issues that matter to them on a daily basis. This is fundamentally what the Tea Party did, by the way. Many people think of the Tea Party approach as being an obstructionist approach in Congress and in local state politics. I actually think of what mattered for the Tea Party was that they did this. They did civil society. And that's what actually gave them the ability to influence the politics of the Republican Party. In terms of institutional options, there's certainly the effort called Indivisible, which is started by a bunch of congressional staffers and tries to give people an insider's view about the formal political mechanisms that are available to them to influence public policy. There's an effort called Knock Every Door, which is trying to restore door knocks as part of the Democratic Party's approach to getting out the vote. There's a group called Swing Left. The object here is to get people who are in left-leaning districts to start to go and door knock in their neighboring districts, which are swing, to try to get them to kind of bring the grassroots effort to the places where it could actually impact the outcome. There's an initiative called Run for Something, which is trying to get progressive people to actually stand for office, kind of swallow the pill and go for it. There's another effort, by the way, that's called Can You Not, which is basically asking cisgender white men not to run for office. Then there's a group called Operation 45, which is trying to introduce people to the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act request, a very powerful tool for being informed about what is actually happening toward whom in the country. There's the ACLU and all of the other legal advocacy groups that are actively fighting and for progressive outcomes in the courts. There's an initiative actually that I'll mention just because of the people who are involved. It's called Impeach Trump Now. It's a website. Now, I'm not so sure about the impeachment bit, but John Bonifaz, who's behind it, and Norman Solomon, these are two people who are incredibly well-regarded voting rights experts, and so when they say things, I pay a lot of attention. Bonifaz was a MacArthur Fellow, a Genius Fellow, a few years back and was involved in the recounts in 2000 in Ohio. There's a group called nationalpopularvote.com, which is an effort to try to get the 50 states to recognize or allocate electoral votes on the basis of the popular vote. And then, of course, there's a Committee for the Protection of Journalists because the free press is a fundamental necessity and the maintenance of a democracy. So I need to wrap up, but I want to wrap up just with a quick summary of what I think an effective resistance will be. An effective resistance will be informed, it will be inclusive, it will be organized, it will go on the offensive, and it will be nonviolent. And this comes from just studies of over 100 years of data about what makes mass movements succeed, even against authoritarian regimes. And the 4 things that they do is that they first assemble a large and diverse coalition of participants. Secondly, they adopt flexible techniques of resistance. So in other words, they're not just doing protests all the time, but they're doing a range of things that are very disruptive yet disciplined. The third thing they do is they maintain nonviolent action even as repression escalates. The fourth thing they do is they elicit shifts in the loyalties of people that are on the quote-unquote other side. And that doesn't mean the people that are the Steve Bannons of the world. It means the median Republican voter who's kind of outraged by the fact that their president isn't representing them, even though they really hoped he would when they voted. And so those are the people to target. The strategy will be years long. It has to put tactics first, or it has to put strategy before tactics. It has to be fun. And it has to have meetings, lots and lots of meetings. So with that, I will wrap it up.
I think it is hard living in America right now not to wake up every morning with fear in the pit of your stomach. You might think that it's the fear that motivates a good athletic performance. But it's a deeper kind of fear. It is a fear that the worst people are going to be hunting. They are going to be hunting for Latinos, as the woman Guadalupe, the mother of 2, found out in Arizona. They are going to be hunting for Muslims. That's their main goal. But of course, there are the rest of us. There's a lot of cheap talk in the Trump campaign. I mean, the real protest campaign was the Bernie Sanders campaign. But in the Trump campaign, the one thing he's done is actually eliminate the grotesque TPP. You know, that was a pretty good thing he did. A lot of people wanted that removed. A lot of people have lost jobs. But if you ask, what's Trump in his multitudinous executive, badly executed orders doing for the white folks? Maybe I missed something. I didn't find anything. This is an important point because actually there's nobody they're not going to come for. There's a lot of cheap talk about impeachment. But Steve Miller yesterday, he went on all the television shows and he said, the judiciary is pretending to be supreme and it must be stopped. The president has the authority to do anything he wants. I would say that the attack on the judiciary is a high crime. There are some others. You want to go after Trump for that reason, that makes a lot of sense to me, right? Not various things about the Russians and so on and so forth, more or less speculative. Though I'll say something about that in a minute. Now, the second point here is, what are we dealing with? We are dealing with pure fascists. They're not authoritarians. They are fascists. They are fascists in the great tradition of Nazism and the Ku Klux Klan. It is worth taking that in because one of the things about it is that this alternate reality worldview they have is not going to go away without resistance. And I'll say one further thing about resistance here. There was a big rally of 10,000 people a week ago Saturday down at the Civic Center Park, and it was a great rally, and it was for embracing our fellow human beings and citizens, Muslims, here. And at one point, about 2 hours into the rally, about 300 people had an afternoon prayer. and the speakers asked if everybody could honor that. And guess what? Everybody did. And I must say I felt really good about being a citizen of civil society here, right? I felt like this is a good place. And I'll tell you the other thing that was interesting. You know, all these folks running around with guns, all the little Nazis, all the Klan, et cetera, there wasn't one of them. They don't seem to be urban people. And one of the things about this is successful fascist movements which actually take over have a rank and file. I have in my life, when I was not nonviolent, fought with the Klan. And my friend Andy Goodman was murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi by the Klan. So I know something about Klan violence. And I will just say, when they're about to take power, no fooling. You know, when you have a demonstration, it's a rougher show. And that underlines the point that anything you think might be worthwhile to do, anything that occurs to you when you're feeling uneasy, doesn't have to be the highest thing, can actually make a huge difference. You know, nobody knew that when Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus, that would trigger the civil rights movement. There are a lot of reasons for thinking it might, but a lot of things like that didn't. The mothers of the disappeared in Argentina went to the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires, 50 of them. The dictatorship, armed by Henry Kissinger, whose handwriting looms over every war crime pretty well throughout Latin America. Nice guy that he is. They had thrown women, having raped them, into the sea, the army. They're about as bad as you can imagine. It's worth reading about them because, you know, if you want to know what Trumpiola represents, that's a fair part of it, if he gets his way. 50 people whose children had disappeared sat in the Plaza de Mayo. And partly because of the patriarchalism, they didn't simply wipe it out. And because they didn't simply wipe it out, guess what? They fell. So when Erica talks about civil resistance, it's a real thing. And mass nonviolent resistance in many, many ways is possible here. Now to go back to who these people are. Mr. Bannon doesn't write much. And the Times ran an article which is based on a guy published on BuzzFeed who actually went and recorded his message to the Vatican. And so if you Google BuzzFeed and Bannon, you can actually read or listen to, I listened to it twice yesterday, his talk. And it's very interesting. He talks about how there's a civilizational war against Islamo-fascists. And that's a funny point for him to make because he himself thinks he's representing the Western people, the white people, the white middle class and workers, the hardworking Americans, and the white Europeans, so that he is himself a kind of fascist. If you take Mr. Sessions, who has a mind meld with Bannon, his leading thing is to crusade against immigrants. He supports the 1924 immigration law. He says it halted the immigration of Southern and Eastern Europeans and Jews, was responsible, now he doesn't say this, for turning the St. Louis back to Germany so that people could go to the death camps who were fleeing toward freedom. The 1924 immigration law, which is celebrated by by Sessions in a conversation with Bannon, it refers to preserving the pure Nordic stock of the United States. It was a time when every the American Political Science Association was run by people who were eugenicists, including earlier on Woodrow Wilson. eugenicists are a code name, or not such a code name, for Nazis. We had many eugenics laws we taught the Nazis. So where does Bannon's view come from, and why are they kind of friendly to the Russians? Well, he gives an answer about Putin, which is fascinating. He speaks of a Putin advisor, he doesn't mention his name, a guy named Dugin, Alexander Dugin. And Dugin has written a book on geopolitics, which is taught under the aegis of the army to every officer there, and it defines the Eurasian influence that Russia, he hopes, will have. He wants this against the United States. Many of the criticisms made of American globalism I regard as true. I regard NATO expansion into Russia toward Russia, right up to its border, instead of taking Russia in 1990 when NATO could have, as a great crime, as a great stupidity and a great crime. And I doubt that if there had been decent leaders in Russia, they would not have reacted strongly to the coup in the Ukraine. That is, you can't, as Khrushchev tried, organize hostility on the borders of another power, like the United States in 1962, and not produce world war. But they are expansionary, and interestingly enough, Putin is an old-fashioned Russian Orthodox social traditional Christian. And there are a fair number of theocons in this country, as they're sometimes called, who are into this. And Bannon is certainly into this. And it's interesting that Dugin says what we want in the United States is to get them out of the business of globalization. So if we get an isolationist in power and we could stir up racism, stir up division, we might get what we want. He actually says that in his 600-page book. Now, I noticed that, but all these people who are making fluff about Russia don't notice that so far. But here's the underlying issue about it. America is a great imperial power. We have 1,180 military bases around the world. They don't talk about the number much. We've divided the world into 6 regions. And it ain't going to go away because Bannon and company are now ruling us. I think we have to think very seriously about whether we want to be an imperial nation and a militarist nation, as Martin Luther King says, or whether we really want to stand for peace and love and decency. There's a great divide here, and every one of you carries within you the possibility to set the thing in motion which will make for our Rosa Parks, which will make for our Plaza de Mayo, which will stop this.
I want to thank you, Nader, for inviting me to participate in this session and to join my colleagues in thinking through these issues of resistance to Trump. Can you hear me? And it's funny, we all give lots of talks, but I found myself getting ready for this one, feeling really jumpy. And I wonder, I'm guessing I'm not the only person who, in confronting this issue, has been asking him or herself, to what degree and how have I been complicit in creating the circumstances that allowed a Trump to succeed? And I think that, and so my talk turned out to be about me rather than the topic, which might be an act of narcissism, but I want to pursue it anyways, because I have a feeling that there are many of us who have traveled a similar road to mine, especially those of us who are of a certain age, who came to politics as part of the New Left and have been around for a while. If I had to give a title to my talk, it would be called Learning from My Mistakes, the Dangerous Allure of the Academic Mindset. And here's what I want to say. Here are my themes. First, I think the opportunities for effective political engagement are greater today than any time during my long lifetime, including those associated with the New Left. I've never seen a historical moment where what's at stake isn't just resisting a particular president, but reorienting politics for the next generation. Extraordinary opportunities here if we are able to grasp them. The question then is, do we respond to this with some degree of optimism, despite the horror that's all around us, with optimism and energy, or do we encounter the world with an exhausting skepticism? I think that I'm going to talk about two different mindsets. That's what I'm calling them. An academic mindset, which I think can and often does generate skepticism and despair, and an activist mindset, which at its best sustains hope even when there's no good reason for hope, even against what appear to be overwhelming odds. So let me tell you a little bit about my own background so you can see how I come at this. I graduated from college quite some time ago, became a labor union organizer, very much as part of my politics, was at the same time a political activist forming all kinds of political initiatives, founding member of the New Haven Green Party. We ran elections. I took 9 months off from graduate school to run for office myself. Essentially, for 11 years, I was a full-time activist around social justice issues, at the end of which I was exhausted, I was skeptical, and I withdrew. And I'd have to say my withdrawal has lasted now 20 years. And so this thinking about this turn in American politics has got me thinking about my own withdrawal and retreat from politics, and this political attitude of despair. And that's what I want to talk about, because I certainly think we can't afford those sentiments anymore, if any of you like me have confronted this problem. Now, the opportunities, I was going to talk about this piece that's in The Nation, but Erica took us through a good bit of it. It's on the back table over there. There's an extraordinary article that tries to catalog all the, well, not all, 20 some odd initiatives that are now underway across the country at the local level, national level, and everything in between to resist Trump. And Erica did a lovely job of summarizing some of those, so I won't have to do that. But when you listen to the list, if you're like me, your default is to say something like this: how the hell can women getting together in a stitch and bitch session, knitting pussy hats, how is that exactly going to resist Trump? I mean, are any of these initiatives by themselves or by itself adequate? Are all of them together adequate? Sure, they've now engaged millions of people, but so what? Is this real? Are these really what's available to us here? And I find that that's the question I run to reflexively when I read about strategies. How can this possibly change the world that's structured by power, geopolitical power, economic power, and the like, and corruption? I now think, and this is a struggle for me, that is the wrong question. I think it's a damaging question, and to get at that, I want to talk about the academic mindset versus the activist mindset. I think there is a choice to be made between these two mindsets, and I think we have it within us to make the choice. The academic mindset, I'm drawing on various theorists here that I'm happy to talk with you about afterwards, but I think that the temptation is to want to know the world through what is now called, especially in some literatures, strong theory. Strong theory is an approach to the world, to theory, that explains the world by reference to its underlying causal drivers. That is to say, we look at the world, it's really complicated, it's mind-bendingly complex, yet we presume that underneath all that complexity, there's an underlying simplicity, some fundamental drivers of human affairs. And so in strong theory, what we try to do is we try to identify what those essences are of human society, and then we try to reduce everything that happens back down to those underlying essences. Or these underlying causal drivers of human affairs. These are taken to be universal, they apply everywhere, and the idea is that the complexity we see is only really apparent. What really is true is the underlying simplicity. This is a feature of many of the theories that we teach our students. So if you've done Econ 101, your basic neoclassical economics is deeply in this tradition. So is orthodox Marxism. Even those two schools of thought are wildly different from each other. They're both trying to ascertain what's the underlying simplicity under the complexity. And what I think was going on for me and for many is that strong theory is one step toward deriving a science of politics, a science that can then tell us what will work and what won't work. Will knitting these hats work? Won't it work? We want to refer back to something we can depend upon, like a science of politics. And so the tendency is to lead us to skepticism towards initiatives that don't measure up to the theory, our strong theory. So for example, there was lots of conversation about the failure of Occupy Wall Street, and there has been a conversation about that now for several years, or the failure of the Women's March. Why? Because they haven't yet generated a unified mass institution, a movement that can be sustained, that can possibly topple someone like Trump. There's a tendency in this strong theory to romanticize struggle. So if people are sleeping out overnight in the middle of the winter, that's got to be efficacious. If people are sleeping in their own beds, it doesn't count, because we're not suffering. I think that strong theory leads us to trying to distinguish those things that count from those things that don't count. It yields an approach to politics which Sharon Welch, a very interesting feminist theologian, calls an ethics of control, or I should say an ethic of control, which presumes that we can know and potentially control the world around us. Now, Sharon Welch and many others argue that this is terribly wrong-headed. This is the wrong way to think about politics. She says, for example, thinking that we can know and control, it's an illusion. It leads us to knowing too much. That is to say, it leads us to believe that we know and can more than we can possibly know and control much more than we can possibly control. As a consequence, it leads us to dismissiveness about all these imaginative and exciting political initiatives around us, but if they don't measure up, they don't fit under our notion of control, then we treat them as epiphenomenal or just self-defeating. The idea here is that strong theory is performative. When we decide, academics and those of us with some influence in the world, when we decide that a certain movement can't possibly achieve its objectives, we actually contribute to its failure by failing to provide it with the resources it needs to sustain itself. And lastly, this approach generates despair. Welch says, when you operate with this kind of a mindset, where your politics are driven by a notion that you can and have a right to control the world, then when you run into obstacles you can't overcome, your only rational response is to withdraw in a moment of despair. After all, why would you keep pushing to change a world that you cannot control? The academic mindset. The alternative. Is there an alternative that can engage us? And I'll just describe this as the activist mindset, which isn't defined by strong theory, it's defined by weak theory. It's a much more appropriate attitude, I think, for sustaining progressive scholarship, but also progressive activism, especially when times seem darkest. And so, for example, weak theory is described here. I'm just going to read you a short quote. The practice of weak theorizing involves refusing to extend explanation too widely or deeply, refusing to know too much. Weak theory could not know that social experiments are doomed to fail or destined to reinforce dominance. It could not tell us that the world economy will never be transformed by the disorganized proliferation of local projects. Weak theory induces a non-skeptical attitude of learning without judgment. In the words of two scholars that I think are really quite great, to treat something as a social experiment is to open to what it has to teach us, very different from the critical task of assessing the ways in which it is good or bad, strong or weak, mainstream or alternative, The idea here is to replace the ethic of control, this presumption that we can know and control, with an ethic of risk that understands that every intervention we make in the world is an experiment. It's a risky experiment. We do them, we learn by doing, we do better, but we never think that we know what will and will not work, what can and cannot work. Instead, we intervene and we intervene and we intervene, mindful always that our interventions are exploratory, provisional, and experimental. The ethic of risk. So let me wrap up. I think what I've learned over the last 2 decades is that when I was an activist and I approached politics, I did so with an ethic of control. I think I had a sense that I had a right to control the world around me, that I knew what should be done, and that my politics was oriented directly toward the achievement of those goals. When I found that, in fact, I couldn't control the world around me, like so many in my generation, we burnt out. We walked away from politics with this sense that what's the point in banging your head against a wall if you can't actually make a difference? The point that I've taken away from this, and it's a struggle for me, and it's one that's been heightened by Trump, is the idea that we have to push back against this ethic of control, and we have to embrace an ethic of risk that urges us not to judge, but instead find ways to sustain political movements that we find agreeable, political movements that we find perhaps in effect, to resist the urge to judge. I'll just end with a line from a famous poem by Antonio Machado. Searcher, there is no road, we make the road by walking. I think that that's a lovely sentiment because it gets at the heart of the fact that we just don't know. There's no road that we're traveling. There's no science of politics. We make that road through our initiatives. So we have to refuse the tendency, the urge to judge and throw ourselves into whichever of these campaigns speaks to us most passionately. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very informative and very insightful. I'm 71 years old, so I've been through a few protests in my life. I'm concerned about what's happening, and I attended a huddle on Friday night that I thought was very informative and very effective in a means of organizing and getting out the word. Erica, you mentioned a book and you didn't name the name. You talked about the authors. Can you tell us what the name of that book was that you were referring to? You mentioned a couple of authors, but you didn't say the name of the book.
Yeah, so was it the Steph Haggard and Bob Kaufman book? Yeah, honestly, I can't remember the name of the title right now, but I will put it up on my blog later. And the blog title is Rational Insurgent. So if you just Google that, I'll have it up tonight.
Thank you, first of all.
Into the microphone so everyone...
Not close enough. Good, better here? Thank you. I guess from the day it became a reality in my mind that we were living in Trumpodia, or whatever it is, that the leadership, or some of the leadership, had to come from academia. So this is reassuring to me that you've done this. And my question really is in that vein. I sat here through most of this, first of all, appreciating your remarks, but secondly, saying, I know lots of people that would like to be here today, but they are ordinary people. They have jobs. I'm retired. I can do this sort of thing. But there are lots of people that I know that would like to, get some ideas, get some leadership, figure out how they can do the next thing. What's your plan?
We'll give everyone a chance. You want to start that?
I already gave you credit for leadership, so now I'll put you on the spot.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. I believe that the most effective uprisings in the world that I've observed have come from ordinary people, kind of like resistance without revolutionaries almost. And in fact, my sense of where we are now in this country is that we need to have lots of conversations like this, but even lots of conversations taking a step back and asking what it is we'd like to see in the world. Who are we and what do we want to experience going forward? What kind of polity do we want to belong in? What kind of leadership embodies that polity? And this is going to require a while. It's going to require patient tending to very sensitive conversations by lots of people in lots of spaces. And so what I hope everybody here might be willing to consider is hosting a salon in your own house. Have people over from your neighborhood and ask these questions. Everybody here is a leader, and if you're here especially, and so, if you can share what you've learned, but also give back a little bit about what you know from your perspective to others, and then hear what they have to say, I think it's going to take patient tending. And in terms of the infrastructure for where we all come back together, I think it's in the works, right? I mean, these huddles are taking place, certainly. A lot of them are still in this very fragmented progressive movement space. And so I'm also eager to see where the convenings will happen. And from what I gather, there are a lot of groups that are organizing strategy sessions right now among a lot of the different members that I mentioned, where they're trying to develop kind of this movement of movements mindset, where there will be an infrastructure for more kind of public conversation. And so I just say stay tuned. But in the meantime, take the initiative if you are able.
And I like that sound. Let me narrow it. Specifically, what are you going to do here? What is, Nader, what's your involvement? George, what are you doing?
Yep.
Because I'm familiar with some of that, okay, and a lot more after today. But the thought-provoking things that happen here today, I want to be able to share with other people that I know are like-minded, you know, that were at my house Sunday, quite literally, yesterday.
Let me ask the other members of the panel to chime in on this question. Alan?
So far as possible, to come participate in any discussions about what to do that people think would be useful. And I think it would be good for many of us in an experimental vein, as George was saying, to do that. I would also say I'm active around Standing Rock. I went there. And anybody who isn't out trying to protect the people there has missed reality. And the same is true with Black Lives Matter, maybe especially, because the animus of this regime is primarily directed at murdering by the police ordinary black people and celebrating the police that do that. So anybody wants to organize that. I'm also involved in writing about and testifying for the right to rest for people, citizens, our fellow citizens removed from their homes who have no place to sleep in Denver and arrested by the police every night. There are 351 ordinances to harass them in Colorado and no thought that they are citizens and that we don't treat our fellow citizens like that. And by the way, on George's point, if you want to know where it came from, that didn't exist until Reagan. It's Carter and Reagan who cut back federal housing. So I would just say there are lots of different possibilities to be involved.
George?
Yeah, I want to repeat a point I made a minute ago, which is this is really a time when there's got to be, you know, 1,000 flowers blooming rather than all of us finding a strategy we can all contribute to. I don't do well in political meetings. I learned that the hard way. I mean, there are certain things I've come to learn about myself, so I'm not going to try and force myself back into fora that I'm just not well suited for. So in my case, I'm an economist. I happen to think that economists are complicit in Trump. I think that for the last 30 years at least, economists have been promoting growth, 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 knowing that the strategies they were promoting were also going to cause harm. They always attached a little footnote to their work saying, yes, but the losers should be compensated. But every economist knows that the losers haven't been compensated. Did that ever stop the economics profession for pushing the policies such as free trade and the like that would lead to this kind of harm? The answer is no. And so now economists are in horror that Trump isn't listening to them. But of course, Trump is a reaction against precisely, Trump and Trump supporters, a reaction against that kind of intellectual overreach by my profession, among probably many other professions. I think my profession's got to be held accountable to that, and my profession's got to learn that when you overreach with what you think you know, and when you permit harm to people in the name of whatever your God is, in this case it was economic efficiency, there's going to be a backlash. There ought to be a backlash. We don't want it to take the form of Trump, but there should have been. Bernie Sanders is right about these issues. So I think that part of my work in the coming period is going to be to hammer home the sins of my profession and the way to move forward in a more ethically responsible way that takes account of the harms that people suffer when economists get their way.
Marie?
Just to quickly add two things. You know, we're in a university setting here, and we're in an international studies school, and we've been teaching, I think all of us for many years, on these subjects that seem sort of far away. You know, the rise of fascist regimes, authoritarianism, war, genocide, all of these things. And for me, it's an opportunity, I think, to actually bring kind of our own domestic context into my classrooms, and to center those conversations and to see really, you know, what we have to learn from, say, the way in which people have been organizing against authoritarian regimes in other parts of the world for decades. There's a lot of listening, I think, that we can do when we look to, you know, our history books, a lot of learning that we can do here from other places. And I think the second thing is that there's also a lot of learning that we can do from people that have been fighting a lot of these battles in our own communities for forever, marginalized communities who have been mobilizing around issues related to equality, social justice, and so forth. And I think, those of us who are kind of, I think in some ways entering this space for the first time should do a lot of listening towards, the challenges that have emerged and how these communities, have been set back in many ways by our own kind of actions and by kind of, by people like myself in ways that I wasn't aware of, So I think for me, there's a lot of listening and then also kind of using the classroom space as a way to learn from other places.
Let's go to the next question. Speak right into the microphone.
Okay, all right. So, along with what you all were just talking about, I was wondering if you have any advice for students right now in terms of what Professor Demartino talked about, the academic versus the activist mentality or behavior, how to spend your time. I know it's a big question, but this is a teach-in, so I'm assuming you guys have some words of advice everyone here is, or most likely most people here, are in an academic setting and have chosen to be in an academic setting, but are also trying to find the time to engage in activism as well, and find that tension of the mentalities all the time. And so any sort of thoughts on how to navigate that, I think I'd really be interested in hearing.
George, you want to start? And we'll come back.
Yeah, I think that politics is often best, people's political engagement, when it's organic, when it rises out of the circumstances where they live. And in the case of college students, there's an enormous social problem that the Trump election hits on, which is access to higher education is restricted at a time when it's never been more important. The life chances of the college graduate compared to the high school graduate, that gap is enormous today and getting wider. It's at a historically unprecedented rate and getting worse. And yet places like DU are far too expensive for most folks who want to and need this. So this was an issue with respect to Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. They were right. This is an area where students might actually take the lead in really raising the question, how do we make higher education available to all those who deserve it, not just to those who can afford it or are lucky enough to get the scholarships and the like. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Let's go to the next question unless any of the panelists want to chime in. You want to say something?
Oh, yes, because Annie, I think what you're getting at too is actually this question of burnout too, right?
Yes.
How do you do both? Like, how do you keep up with your studies, and how do you also, stay centered as a healthy human being? And I don't have a good answer for you because I don't think, I know how to do that necessarily. But, but I would say that. What I was sort of trying to emphasize is this idea that not all of our resistance will be visible, right? That not all of the resistance will look like protests, like petitions, like boycotts, like sit-ins. A lot of the resistance will actually be in the way in which we engage in our day-to-day interactions in a way that's a shift from sort of, and that's more, that centers this idea and the importance of inclusion and of equality and of respect and of love, and those things kind of at the center, of our own engagement with human beings. And so I would just say, because I know how active you are too, that to think creatively perhaps about the limits of your own engagement, and then to think about how that energy might be shifted in kind of different ways throughout this resistance, because this is not a sprint. This is going to be a marathon, and the momentum now, yes, needs to continue and needs to kind of even get more intense, but it's also something that we need to be careful of as individuals, that that we're not going to, as George talked about, after 11 years, burn out, right?
One thought I have after many years of being an activist, I have never not been an activist, is if you don't breathe in, as the Chinese say, you don't get to live to 100. In fact, you don't even get to do anything the next time. So one of the things to think about is how this works for you. I know people in the sciences, particularly in environmental sciences, who in their courses are doing work about the point that Bernie raised, trying to save the planet and save humanity against Trump, and immediately feeds into activism, or can immediately feed into activism. I know a couple of people in writing courses who decided to write about homeless folks and went down to Homeless Out Loud. It is possible to connect with Black Lives Matter quite easily here and to find out what's going on. And in Denver, it's pretty horrifying. And there's lots to be done about it. I would be happy to talk to anybody here about any of these matters. And my name is Alan Gilbert. If you don't know me, send me an email, come talk to me, I'll talk.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I would just reiterate the oxygen mask technique on planes, the putting it on yourself before you help the person next to you. I've heard a lot of organizers use that as a good analogy for this, and I think that fits. Just to your question earlier, too, the book is called Dictators and Democrats, Masses, Elites, and Regime Change. So Dictators and Democrats, Masses, Elites, and Regime Change.
My question is very similar. Well, first of all, I never had the chance to take any classes with any of y'all before I graduated, but your brains make my heart happy. I've had the opportunity to hear all y'all talk before, so thank you very much for what you do personally and professionally. My question is very similar to my question is very similar. Whoa. Do a little dance. Similar to Annie's, but probably more sharp, as I tend to be. I was surprised in coming here as a student how little of a spirit of activism there is, especially coming from a marginalized community. And so when you have the triple burden of like learning things yourself, like expanding your own mind, worrying about things on the federal and international level, and then wanting to improve an institution at the same time that's not terribly welcoming, and in my estimation, and I don't see career services put this out, but produces more systems fillers than systems like fixers and changers. It shouldn't come from the institution, but what do we do with the institution, where we are?
So could you just clarify the question a little bit? What do we do at the institution in terms of where we are, to what end?
Yeah, and like these kinds of talks, obviously with your beautiful brains, are wonderful, but stuff should come more from students who are the most burdened in this process.
Alan?
So I've been active in a movement which has taken 100 people to see the chancellor about sanctuary here. And there are meetings every week and a half of 20, 30 people. And boy, do we need more students, although there are some. And I would just say about it that often the word doesn't quite get around that stuff is happening. So I, again, would be happy to talk with you afterwards. I think George's suggestion is a brilliant one, which is debt slavery is the biggest issue. New York Times had an article today about how people who have funded their children going to college have remaining debt, and the government is taking money out of their Social Security. So under our miserable private system, you know, they can't pay for health care and so on and so forth, right? Seemed to me that's an explosive issue.
Maybe my question is still very connected to the two previous questions, but it's mainly about Middle Eastern non-citizen students at DU. I know some of them personally, and most of them are very intimidated. Most of them are fearful. And I think they need to speak out their minds and to speak out about their own fears and their own emotions, but they don't want to take any progressive action beyond the campus or off-campus kind of actions, political or social, simply because they are fear. I mean, they are legal, they are documented, but they don't want to jeopardize their legal status here, especially some of them are already from listed countries, some of them are from Middle Eastern countries that might be listed soon, nobody knows. So do you have any advice for those students? Thank you very much.
Well, Eric asked me to weigh in on it. And I don't think I have any easy answers to the question, because I'm reading reports of people coming into the United States with
green cards with legitimate visas. And when we get to the border control, they're asking for people's passwords, Facebook accounts, and a complete sort of, investigation that you don't associate normally with the United States. You associate it with our authoritarian regimes back in the Middle East. So, people who are on visas and who come from particularly those 7 countries or other countries in the Middle East and North Africa have legitimate fears. I don't know what to tell them. Everyone, I think, has to make their own individual decisions in terms of how far they can go. Perhaps one concrete thing they can do, if they're scared to speak out, is to ally themselves with other groups who have status here, who can then perhaps be their voice. But other than that, I have no deeper insight. I completely sympathize with the frustrations. I met with a group of students in engineering. Many of our students who are on visas from these 7 countries and don't know what to do are in the engineering department on this campus, and they're completely petrified. And so beyond that, I don't know what to say.
I would say this issue brings up the important topic of what does allyship actually look like. And certainly this comes up a lot in the context of movements advocating on behalf of marginalized communities, particularly when threat is at its highest level against them. And so I think that's a delicate dance between making sure that people who do have privileged status are aware and informed about the issue and are quick to mobilize on behalf of their neighbors without then, kind of overtaking the movement and deciding on its future direction. And so I think there are a lot of really interesting examples from around the world of when this has taken place effectively. Certainly, some people point to the US civil rights movement, the early phase of it, as being an example of this. But another set of examples come from cases where you have, say, self-determination movements that are a very small proportion of an overall population, then having alliances with people who have privilege in the larger country setting. So like East Timor and Indonesia, for example, or Tibet and the United States. So there's a lot of examples from history, but I think it's, we need to kind of balance it with the tendency for people of privilege to then think they know what's best and kind of overtake the strategy of the movement.
Anyone else? Let's go to the next question.
So I only have 2 comments. One is, I think, directly toward Middle Eastern students. Know your rights. Advise yourself legally. Be as good as you can be. And for others, if you want to create heaven, it's a long process and you have to die first. Do what you can.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here today. I know you said you don't necessarily speak for the school, but you speak for all of us, and I want to say thank you very much for that. Secondly, and then of course Dean Hill as well. He was on Morning Joe this morning. But all of you are putting yourself out there, and that means so much. And I don't know how many other schools are doing this type of thing, but again, thank you. Up until now, with the campaign and then the election, and now the first few weeks of the administration, a lot of people thought it was funny and cute and stupid, and they could dismiss of it. But all of a sudden, in the last 2 days or so, when you had people, first of all, like Stephen Miller, who hit all the rounds yesterday, that was very scary, and that kind of changed the mood, it changed the tone, and now things become more serious and more scary. So you have Stephen Miller, who, honest to God, a propagandist who reminded me of Josef Goebbels. You could have almost switched the pictures. The words would have been the same. Very scary. Secondly, you have Bannon, the presidential whisperer and white supremacist. Another very scary individual. Now we have Mike Flynn, of course, the general, supposedly respected general, who now becomes the Russian conspirator, working behind the scenes to undermine the country. And now the liar-in-chief. Finally, you have Trump, President Trump, with the ban, the undermining of the press, the judiciary, Muslim, women, and lastly, the silent Congress, who's just amazingly and eerily silent during the last few days. Also very scary. what I find so difficult is that every day over the last 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks, it's another daily shock. And it's so difficult to get your arms around it because there's so much coming from so many different directions. And this is what has me so concerned. And again, Miller especially really brought it home yesterday. And I guess my question is, I'm really stumped how to, because the press can't even keep up with it. They can't deal with it every day. So many things, all the incoming. And I just would like your suggestions on how we can possibly get our arms around this and try to change this very difficult situation. Thank you.
Let's start it and we'll come back because that's a meeting. You want to start, George?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll come down.
I mean, okay, so again, this goes back to what I talked about earlier when I told you my own autobiography. 20 years ago, I would have said to myself, where's the glue that's going to unify all the opposition so that we have one vehicle that would be powerful enough, big enough, strong enough to resist? I don't see it that way anymore. Every one of the atrocities has has generated a constituency of activists who are pushing back. And I think that that's what we should expect for now. And is that enough? I don't know. I don't know that that's the relevant question. I think the point is to expect that journalists are taking up arms against fake news and against the assault on the press. Lawyers are going to work on all kinds of questions that have to do with protecting the judiciary, and on and on and on and on. The absence of a unified movement that pulls all this together, I work hard these days to try to convince myself that that's just not a problem, and that we shouldn't despair of the absence of a unified movement that we can say, okay, we've all got it together.
I would notice the good things, like I think they aren't able to kick everybody off health insurance this week. In fact, it seems to be receding. They're having a lot of trouble about that, right? They've done enormous harm, and it created enormous fear, but the fact is that the mass movement stopped them about deporting people with green cards and so on and so forth, and they've been in retreat, and the courts have backed it up. I would take in, and I think I would urge everybody here, Miller is the active voice of Bannon and Sessions. He has written many of the executive orders. He is really, really crazy. And by that, I mean, if you look at that face and watch him walk around, really, there are many personalities in there. They're not in control. Now, that doesn't just distinguish him from Kellyanne Conway, for example, but nonetheless, that this is what is set upon us is worth, and that Trump applauds it, who is also quite crazy. This is a big deal. I would say that one of the things that we should focus on all out is pushing the Democrats, and Schumer is quite good on this at the moment, to resist their Supreme Court nominee by shutting down the government. And if they won't do it, I would suggest that we all go do it. If Trump appoints this monster or any other to the Supreme Court, that is the end of law here, which, you know, there's civil society, and we got to resist. But that's one of the things we got to resist about. I think a lot of people will come along with us to do that. You just have to listen to Miller about keeping down the courts and Schumer's question, so are you going to stand up or not for law to this silly man, which he couldn't actually, he took back what little he said to Schumer, you know, worth taking it.
Think on it
Okay.
a minute.
Yeah, so it's a good question. A couple things. There's a great book by Rebecca Solnit called Hope in the Dark. It's a really quick read. She writes easily. And it's all about looking for the things that we do accomplish even when it looks like we're failing. So, for example, she talks about the protests that occurred before the Iraq War. They didn't stop the Iraq War, but they delayed it, they made light of it, and they made it so that who knows how many thousands of people were able to flee before the bombardment began. So it's important to think about the things that are accomplished when we get into action, even if we aren't able to achieve full success. Limit your consumption of news. Don't watch it on the television. Read your news. We know that TV actually deliberately means to elicit emotional responses, which can become overwhelming. So I don't watch TV at all, really, except for America's Funniest Home Videos, which is great on a Sunday night. But basically, I don't watch TV. I read the news, and that really helps. There are great baby videos on YouTube as well. And then find comfort where you can, especially in humor. There's a lot of work that's written by many different people who've been involved in pro-democracy movements and indigenous rights movements and minority rights movements and women's rights movements that are all about how important it is to keep the laughter going and to keep humor forefront at the head of the movement. And so that's one thing that's so powerful about so many of the even very desperate looking movements over the course of history is how they were able to maintain hope in part through maintaining as much humor as they could, even when the humor became dark. Yeah, I mean, whatever makes you laugh is good. Not everybody likes Saturday Night Live, but I think it's hilarious. But everybody laughs at America's Funniest Home Videos. And then the last thing I would mention is how important it is just the signaling in the international system. You know, I was very struck by the fact that many of the people that I follow abroad watch the protests and say, I believe in America because of these protests. I know it's not over, right? And that's a really important thing to demonstrate continually, even if it doesn't have a short-term kind of policy implementation change, to demonstrate continually that the thing that people, think that America is as imperfect and gross as it is sometimes, that we're fighting for it, right? We are fighting for it, and some of us with our lives, and we're willing to.
Let's take the last two questions or comments back to back, and then we'll wrap it up. We have to start getting to a conclusion, so as quickly as you can.
Sure, I'll be quick. A couple of thoughts. Thanks for your thoughts on fun. What I do for fun is volunteer and do some civic engagements. A couple of thoughts. One is the Margaret Mead phrase that says, "Never underestimate the power of a small group of people to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Well, a little tongue-in-cheek, I look at the 1%. It's a small group of people, and they pretty much own the world. So I want to bring that out there. And that which brings me to another thought about our Constitution. I don't want to be simplistic and reduce it, but it's basically a document that protects property and commerce, wealth. So when I think about that, and our Constitution is the document that defines us as a people, when I think about that, it's no wonder that we are in the quagmire, in the mess we're in. So I want to bring that out as well. And then finally, Dr. Gilbert, you mentioned the Standing Rock. I was at the protest yesterday for divesting. That's it. So tonight at the City Council, they are going to be asking the City Council to divest the city's funds from the banks, which will go a great way to helping the indigenous. So thank you.
Tell us where the city and the council meets for anybody who'd like to go.
It's down at the Civic Building, and
The city
across
and
from
county building.
City and County Building, across from the Civic Center Park, right there.
And what time is it?
5:30 is when it starts to meet, and I'm not quite sure when the public comment meets, but certainly it'd be very helpful to stand up for that. Stand up for Standing Rock. Thank you.
Last comment or question.
Like this gentleman said here, we are in this quagmire and we're here and we just have to move forward. I think it's great that we're reacting to a lot of the things we think is wrong that Trump's doing, but I think one of his biggest pillars was job creation. And I really don't think that the tide is going to turn until we start incorporating people who voted for him for jobs into our movement. And so my question is it just going to be a waiting game until Trump doesn't fulfill those promises to those people, or are we going to take steps to incorporate them into this movement? Because right now, it's two different groups.
That's a good comment. Could you answer any of the last two comments and then include include perhaps a summary or final statement if you want to share with the audience on comes next, the way forward. Or you want to start?
Okay.
We'll start this way and go down.
I mean, I can't agree more with you, and that's part of, I think, what I was getting at in talking about being inclusive, both of people that we agree with and of people that we don't agree with. There's a great civil rights activist named Bernice Reagan who once said that if you're comfortable with everyone in your coalition, you're not in a coalition. Mm-hmm. And that, I mean, I think that speaks to the need to not keep these conversations siloed to those with whom one already agrees. And so, and actually there's a need to recognize that not everybody within the movement is going to have the same kind of access to people that voted for Trump as others. So, for example, I have people in my family that it's my job to talk to them, not somebody else's job who is in a different situation than me. So much of this is about exploiting the networks that are already there and recognizing the bounds to those and expanding the coalition. And I would just say in closing that a lot of people I've been at a lot of the actions, and there's these great signs that speak to the creativity and the hope of this movement. A lot of them, quoting Star Wars, every resistance is built on hope, and things that are really resonant with people in the popular mood today. And I think so much of where we're going is going to depend critically on the choices we make now about what kind of movement we want to see and what kind of country we want to live in when it's over. And for it to be the type of country where we live at peace with our neighbors, it has to kind of embody the different ideals I think that we've been talking about here. And I'm doing my best to try to make that happen and encourage you all to as well.
Sure. Yeah, I want to echo Erica's kind of emphasis on this idea of inclusion in the movement and on a need for those of us who have been involved in protest activities, involved in some of these campaigns, to really, this goes back to comments a few minutes ago, but really to understand kind of the different identities and challenges that every person that's participating is coming to those movements with or is not coming with, because, as was brought up earlier, we could say, let's all go to the Women's March, or let's all go downtown and protest the Muslim ban and things like that. But there are members of our community right here in Korbel who don't feel safe doing so. And I think it's on us it's on all of us to really acknowledge the different challenges and limitations that people come to this movement and this process of resistance with. And I'll also emphasize this. I think we haven't talked a lot about this, but the importance of Congress in the resistance. And there's been some really important, I think, writings in the last week about what role Congress is clearly not playing, and then what role Congress actually has the constitutional authority to play. And so we're in Colorado. We're in I think local efforts focused on the 2018 elections really will matter in Colorado, and I think we can all have Cory Gardner's number on our speed dial. Call him every day over coffee. I mean, I think he we have somebody. I don't know what district you're all from, but if you have Democratic, Congress representatives, Congress people, we all have at least one Republican that represents us in the nation's capital. So I think we need to actually really hold them to account. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that this question is good to meditate on. I don't think you should come to a quick answer about it. So all my life I've fought racism among white folks. And I think anybody who wants to exist in the society of Mr. Trump will die either through World War, which Mr. Bannon has in mind, or through being suffocated. I've just been in Delhi, where you can't breathe. Asia, you can't breathe. The Chinese go in for some green cities because you can't breathe. We will not be able to breathe here very shortly, right? I think all the white folks and all your children and all the people you love, you better think about that. So let's think about DU. There's a lot of talk here about diversity, but when we are confronted with shocking racist acts toward black students who put up the Black Lives Matter, not quite so sure how we're going to deal with that. I think actually the thinking out how you talk to those of our fellow students who have these views or those who have better views, but I know a lot of people in the military, and they seem, by and large, to have voted for Trump. They don't like Trump, but they didn't like Clinton. I think better talk to them. Take the business school. How many people are there? I bet you we can find some Trump folks. I think it would be very good. You know, think about where or who you know where it might be useful to ask them what the hell they think and have a discussion.
I'm going to talk about something a little bit. I agree with what my colleagues have to say. I'll just take a different attack just to wrap up. A number of years ago, I was invited to Davos to participate in the World Economic Forum. Now, that's the 1%, plus a bunch of government leaders who assembled to talk about what their vision is for the world and how they're going to achieve it. And those who get invited have to fill out a survey. And one of the questions in the survey is, what do you see as the biggest threat to economic stability this year? The year before I was invited, the answer to that question was natural disasters, tsunamis. That's what was concerning the 1%. The year that I went was the year right after Occupy Wall Street. And so we got this, I got my little survey and I wrote down inequality, knowing that the answer the year before was tsunamis. And in fact, when they released the results, the biggest concern of the people at Davos that year was inequality. And it was because of Occupy Wall Street. This is the 1% talking about what they were worried about. I then got invited to go to a private meeting because one of our Korbel students works for the World Economic Forum. She thought I might be interested in a meeting with leading bankers and leading government bank regulators. There was like 2 or 3 bank regulators and some of the richest people I've ever seen in my life in this room for 2 hours talking about where are we in the world financial system. And a lot of the talk was about the failures of the themes were, how come everybody's blaming us for the crisis of 2008? And second, our financial system is failing the real sector. And when we finished our deliberation for 2 hours, the person who convened the meeting stood up and said, ladies and gentlemen, we have tested the limits of inequality. This is not sustainable. We had better fix it because if we don't, somebody else will. And people nodded their heads and left. I was astounded. I'd never been around the 1% before. I didn't know what they talked about. But what was interesting to me was the way, I mean, Erica said earlier, the world is listening to what people are doing here. And I think that that's quite right and terribly important. But that 1%, they can't control the world either. And they are listening too. And change often comes when the 1% decides, oh my God, we'd better make some progressive reforms because if we don't, someone else will. So I'm not so daunted by the 1% anymore, not just because of that interaction, but because of this notion that they don't control the world either. They have a lot more influence than you and I, but they don't control the world. They didn't pick Trump. And so the point, I think that the proliferation of activities that are underway now are fantastic. There's never been a moment like this in my life, and I'm older than most of you, and throwing ourselves into the pieces that excite us the most, that's good enough. And if we can do that, we're much more likely to sustain our activism and take care of ourselves and breathe and be able to do it again next year and the year after and the year after. I think that that's the way to go. It's the only way to go, but it's also the best way to go. So.
Well, that's a great positive note to end on. Let me first thank the panel, my colleagues, for being here. Please join me in thanking them. And as I said at the beginning, one of the goals of this event was to sort of hopefully spark and promote more discussion and debate. I'm hoping other people, particularly students, can take the initiative. We've just scratched the surface. As I said, this crisis is not going away. There's a lot of work that needs to get done. And universities, the values of universities, I think, have increased significantly as forums for discussion, debate, sites of resistance. So I'm hoping that all of you can take advantage of the opportunity that we have to gather here at this university to try and think through some of these important issues that confront our democracy. Thanks. See you again.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good job.